Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted that you're joining us for this webinar on release of information. And we had discussed some of the areas that we felt like would be important to provide additional information to the programs and to the counselors, program staff, and a discussion took place about the release of information. And so we put together this webinar, and we're looking forward to discussing with you all today this topic. So our learning outcomes today, upon completion of the webinar, we are hoping that participants will learn, number one, the importance of establishing a written policy and procedure on the release of applicant or consumer confidential information. Number two, that when specifically an ROI is required when working with a consumer. And number three, also that we will learn the steps for the release of applicant or consumer confidential information for the provision of VR services, resulting in an employment outcome. So those are the three main areas. The federal regulations, confidentiality, and ROIs, we want to discuss that this morning and talk about different areas of the federal regs. We want to let you know that AIVRTAG will provide federal regulation information pertaining to AIVRS programs, but we do not interpret federal regulation. So if you need interpretation of a FedReg, you need to contact your RSA project officer for your program to request them to interpret the regulation for you. Also, ROIs are associated with the application and eligibility process of your AIVRS program, so the applicant of VR services. And federal regulations refer to applicant and individual, but no mention of consumer. So we use that word consumer a lot in our programs, but the federal regs do not address that particular title. So they always refer to applicant or individual. And consumers, oh, sorry, go back, please. That last line there, consumers will be named in this webinar because of the regulation where a copy of a case file may be requested. Does anybody have any questions, comments? We're really hoping to get a lot of input from you guys today because we want to hear what you're doing in your programs. So when we're talking about the CFR, the release of information, or what we call the ROI, this webinar is based on that federal regulation 34 CFR part 371.44 special requirements, and it pertains to the protection, use, and release of personal information for your consumers. So Suzanne has prepared a handout, and we're going to share that with you guys on the regulations. So if you may want to open that up separately and look at that. I'm not sure if everybody can see it okay. But we want to talk about 371.44. What are the special requirements pertaining to the protection, use, and release of personal information? And it states, number one, that tribal vocational rehabilitation units must adopt and implement written policy and procedures to safeguard the confidentiality of all personal information, including photographs and lists of names. These policies and procedures must ensure, and it has a list of the following. Can everyone see that fairly well?
Yes.
Okay. So we asked the question, why does your AIVRS program, why are they required to have a confidentiality policy? And we just answered that. Does anyone want to comment on their policy in regards to confidentiality? Anyone? Okay, let me ask a question. Does every program have a confidentiality section in their policy and procedure manual?
Vocational does.
Good. Okay. I'm looking at the chat box over here. Okay, Karen says that they do have a policy stating that they have an outline for self-harm or harm to others.
The
Okay.
ROIs come under the heading of confidentiality. And when you think about what are some of the things that you have in your confidentiality policy and procedure, and is ROI, you know, if it's not in there, you don't have to share that, but it's something that you're probably going to consider after this particular webinar that you want to have. So you know, think about confidentiality and tell us what needs to be kept confidential and why. And I'll start calling on people. There's Meredith, and there's Casey, and Susie. Casey, do you have something you want to say? You want to tell us about confidentiality and a piece that might be in yours?
Mm-hmm. So Maisie said medical certification from the provider. Yes, absolutely. Any documentation that your consumer is providing the program in regards to their disability.
You want to say anything? Rachel?
Joanna, she says that this is to protect people that they work with in their program. That's absolutely correct. It is for the protection of the consumer.
Christopher, you want to share what you wrote in the chat box for everyone? Boy, we have a bunch of silent people. Are they, John, have we released the microphones? They might be trying and we might have them locked out.
This is Carrie, and your question about like what is considered confidential, I think it's a lot of it has to do with what was already mentioned, and I'm thinking more of like personal information, like your address, your the medical records that we do get, their like identifying information, I guess is what I would consider confidential. And I'm trying to think, but I'm drawing a blank, but those are some of the things that came to my mind as you were asking the question.
Thank you. Hey, Michelle Wilson.
This is Christopher.
Hey, Christopher.
Hey. Yeah. So when I'm thinking of confidentiality, I'm going beyond just the minimum for in my own head. If I am in a meeting where I don't have an ROI signed by a consumer, and I want to get some advice from a colleague, let's say, but I start off by saying I've got a guy who's about 35. He's got 3 kids. He lives on the res. He's been dealing with the fact that he had his left leg amputated. Pretty soon, the people I'm talking to and giving that much information, though I've not stated a name or address or phone number, or I've stated enough identifying information that a person can start figuring out there are only so many people who have, you know, an amputated leg. There are only so many people who are 35 with 3 kids. There are only so many of those living on the res. So pretty soon, you know, the person I'm talking to has figured out who I'm talking about. So now when I start sharing real personal stuff about that person, medical information, let's say, now I'm really going beyond what's allowed, I think, in the confidentiality regulations, because I really need, I've given enough information for people to figure out what I'm talking about. Now I start sharing some personal information. I've broken confidentiality, even though technically I haven't listed the person's name, address, phone number.
Mhm.
So that's how I think of it. As soon as I have given enough information for people to know who I'm talking about, I need to start thinking about everything I'm sharing about them. What is the stuff that I can legally share?
Mhm.
I think
That's right.
excellent.
You're absolutely right, Christopher. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see why we are required to have a confidentiality policy. John, if you could pull up the next slide.
Hey, Jamie, can we talk about this a little bit before we jump ahead? Because I think
Sure.
Looks like you're frozen, Suzanne.
So
We
we got a
got to the
question
next
in the,
slide. Yeah,
we got
just
a,
go.
then we have that problem. So I think this is really an important thing to think about. How do we share information without breaching that confidentiality? And it goes beyond what's in regulations sometimes, and it's the moral ethics, or I'm saying moral, ethics here. But it's really something we need to figure out how to share with people. Go ahead, Jamie. I'm sorry. I was wondering if anybody else wanted to address this before we move forward. Does somebody else want to share about a situation and have some comments to make about Christopher's sharing? Okay, I guess not. Go ahead, Jamie. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to land on this slide because we asked the question, why are we required to have this in our policy manual? And this is the answer. Because we're protecting the confidentiality of all persons, their personal information, anything that pertains to the applicant or the consumer of your AIVRS program. So that's the reason why we're required to have that policy, is to protect the consumer. And just as Christopher, Amanda, and Julie, I think all others said, you know, it's for the protection of the consumer. So I'm wondering, you know, let's talk about the different types of releases. There's a release for personal information, correct? There's releases for school records. There are releases for medical records. There are releases to discuss with other agencies, services for this individual. Does anyone want to talk about the different types of releases and in what scenario you would use them?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Meredith.
Hi, this is Meredith, and I am working on our policy for confidentiality and protection of case records. And currently, my new policy that I'm writing is based on requests for release of information, and I do have several forms that I would require our consumers to be able to agree on before a prior release of information. So I know this is one of a big issue for our program, because we just have a very small blurb confidentiality policy right now. So I'm trying to enhance it and make it better for our consumers. And I also included in there a release to report abuse, stating that for our consumers, in case there's any potential harm to themselves or person with disability or a child, that would be information that would be required to release information when it's a serious threat to health safety.
Thank you, Meredith. I appreciate that. So are we ready to turn it over to Wayne?
Yes. Wayne, you want to pick up from here and move forward? Also, I want to say real quickly, Rachel made a great point in the chat box if anyone gets the opportunity to read that.
Why don't you read it? Or why don't we have Rachel read it? Rachel? Jamie?
So I'll jump in here real quick. Rachel was just making a point that when we were talking about HIPAA confidentiality and the two, and how HIPAA is kind of the catch-all term that we're all aware of in the medical field, where confidentiality is more of what we follow under the tribal VR programs. And so I think it, like Rachel's saying, you know, a lot of it is that there's legal boundaries that we have to be aware of and to protect the privacy of our consumers. So in that general term, you know, I agree that HIPAA is one that's tossed around because everybody knows that. And confidentiality is really what we follow, and how we approach it is different than HIPAA. And as we go along in this presentation, you'll see that difference. So right now I got a question. What are the features included in your AIVRS Program Confidentiality Policy? So can you guys jump in the chat box or unmute yourself and just tell us real quick what you have in your policy? You know, sometimes in the policy you need to cover rights and remedies, cap, that type of thing. Anybody got any ideas? Amanda says our agency oversees the health clinic and we all have to follow HIPAA. Staff are required to take a test every year after watching the HIPAA video. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Suzanne. Some of the features that we see in the program confidentiality, you know, we look at releases of information, of course, rights and remedies, cap, tribal memberships, assessments, medical, behavioral health, psychological. And so this goes back to an earlier post in the chat box. There's a question about how do we handle sensitive evaluations and assessments. And so we start to see this starting to flesh out here in the process. We have to identify what we're going to protect. And so now you can see where you start to outline your process of protecting those documents in your policy. So in order to provide that confidentiality, we have to define what it is and how we do it. Anybody have any comments? Can you also address court orders? Okay, so what I assume can you jump on and tell us what you mean by court orders?
Who's talking about court orders? Oh,
Nala.
Looks like the video and audio are not connected for Anita. I think that's what Winona's saying. I think she's just coming in from chat.
Hello. I have included in our new policy that I'm working on an information regarding attorney request or subpoena or court order. And I added that in there mainly because I'm working with the wellness court for the Hopi tribe. And one of my consumers is requesting a treatment plan, or how our plan is working, an action plan that I work on. So at the bottom, I do have a release of information and confidentiality that I do have them sign. So I'm working on this to be included in our protection and release of information policy.
So when we're releasing, when we're releasing these court requested documents, can you give me your feedback on how that's done, Meredith?
Well, as I mentioned, this one was for the wellness court, and their plan to go back into or actually exiting out of the wellness treatment center, they need to have an actual plan they develop prior to. So we've been working with their AA, their counselor, as well as with me to develop a plan. And so, you know, this plan is part of our program. So in order for me to release it to the court, I had to make sure we had come up with a policy to kind of go step by step, and at the end have a release of information form signed specifically for this type of information.
Okay. And Anita jumped on us and clarified a little bit about what she was saying. When a judge requests records from our office, it can be sometimes be a concern because sometimes the request doesn't seem justifiable. And I apologize. There's a big piece of equipment backing up and the backup alarm's going off. So if it starts to get distracting, please somebody stop me and I'll mute my microphone. So as we're going through this part, it's really a difficult answer to this question that keeps coming up about the legal stuff. So when we get medical records from like an evaluator and we pay for those notes, they become our property. Okay. So it's our responsibility at that time to maintain the confidentiality in those records. If we get subpoenaed by a judge to release those records, now we come to that dilemma. What is beneficial for that case or what is harmful for that case becomes the question. And that requires a process that we will look at later on in the presentation also. So we don't just freely release all of our information. We have to protect our consumer. That's the ultimate thing.
Wayne,
I forgot to add too that we do in this current policy, or the one I'm working on, will be court orders should be sent to the Hopi Tribal Attorney General's office prior to any type of release of information.
Okay.
When it's pertaining to psychological or documents you had mentioned.
Okay, awesome. And Karen also brought up that Northwest Indian College has a really good training video on common sense confidentiality and how easy it is to break confidentiality without intent. So again, that, you know, Northwest Indian College has a lot of good material out there. And I know online they have some modules that you can look at. Somebody else had said my name before Meredith jumped on. I want to make sure they have a chance to talk.
Hi, this is Michelle. I was just going to say that when we have somebody request us to release information, our policy is to only release things that we've created. So if they ask for, especially like psychological records or anything that we have requested and they brought to us or been sent to us, we do not release that. We send them back to the original originator to get that. And then as far as court records, we require a subpoena, and that goes to our tribal justice system as well. We would be very leery of doing that. And we've had instances where the court has asked for that information for custody issues that had nothing to do with the person's case with us, but they were trying to show mental stability and all of that. And because we're dealing with them at the level that we are, it would have been very detrimental had they gotten those records. So, I think just caution is the biggest thing there.
Thank you, Michelle. I was hoping somebody would bring that part up. So when we aren't the originators of the documentation that's being requested, you always send it back to that person. So that psychiatrist, that psychologist, that other therapist or whatever that person's or whoever that person's working with, that's where you send them to make those requests. So thank you guys for all that participation. Let's go to the next slide, Suzanne. The blanket ROI. It sounds so comforting and warm and snuggly, doesn't it? Can you tell me what that is? What is a blanket ROI?
I'm gonna take a stab at it. This is Carrie. I'm thinking that it would be um, a, like an ROI to where you kind of just would make it more general instead of specifically request or, you know, putting in the details in there. So that way it covers a more variety or like a wider range of subject area instead of just the specifics that you're talking about or wanting to have that collaboration on or with, like maybe an entity or something like that.
Okay. We also got a couple in here. Rachel says covers everything. And Amanda says we have multiple providers on it. Julie says it would be an ROI that just signed by the consumer without any other information to who it would go to. So, okay, that sounds like it's a pretty good one. Let's go to the next slide, Suzanne. We got a pretty good definition on what is a blanket ROI. Oh, here, is it allowed? Amanda says, due to HIPAA, we are no longer able to do that. We're getting a bunch of no's in here. How come? How come we can't do that? How come we?
Carrie again, and I'm gonna say, I was looking through the chat and I saw one, I don't know who it was, but I saw one that said that it would just be a blank one that you would have the consumer sign. That is, I think, a big no, and we are told like not to do that because, you know, there could be situations to where I mean, it wouldn't be right because you're not even really getting a consent from the consumer then of what goes in the middle of it, you know, the meat of it. And that could get you in a lot of trouble. And not only that, for us, I know we're not allowed to do a blanket PO. We have to be specific. And even if that means that we make multiples, of, you know, to the same entity, we would still have to make it and be, you know, just make sure that we are working with the consumer for them to know that this is the only information we're requesting for, you know, and if we needed to kind of go a little bit over or more, then we would have to do another one to make sure that we include that language in there as well. So that's just my thing.
Thank you. So we got a couple of responses here in the chat box too, that go along that same line of it needs to be specific. Go and go to the next slide, Suzanne, please. It needs to be specific in order to protect the consumer and the applicant. It also has to be, we got to think about the end user, right? So when we look at where these ROIs are going to, we have to protect our consumers always. So if we're going to an employer saying we need a release of information to help, you know, set up work accommodations, that type of thing, we can't just do a blanket blank ROI to that individual. We have to be specific in what we're going to release, who we're going to release it to, that type of thing. And on this slide, you can kind of see we got some of the stuff in there about what you shouldn't do, why you shouldn't do it. And when it comes down to it, is this used to be standard practice both in AIVRS world and in the state VR world, and they found that there was just too much information being inappropriately, unintentionally shared amongst the providers and the employers and whoever was involved in that blanket release. Any other comments on that? That one's one that really we want to make sure that's very clear that it's not allowable. We have to write a release of information for every event that we use that information for.
I would just like to make one comment, Wayne. As a VR counselor myself, it seems that most agencies, educational institutions, are now requiring that you put a specific time frame on your ROI. So used to, you could just request any information from any agency or institution, and get every bit of records on that consumer. But now most places say you specifically have to give a time frame from this date to this date.
So we should move to the next one if there are no more comments on that.
Yeah.
Okay,
And so
so
I'm going to pass off the baton to Suzanne now.
thank you, Wayne. My question to you is, does the AIVRS Program Confidentiality Policy and Procedure include A, applicants' request for a copy of their complete file, and B, applicants' request for a copy of a doctor's assessment report? And I think Michelle touched on that already. So we want to revisit this and have a little bit more dialogue. Do we need more dialogue, or are we finished with this slide? So if we go to the first one, this is what the regulation tells us about. So I'm going to leave it up there, and we would like some dialogue, please. Michelle, do you have anything else you want to add to what you said earlier? You talked when somebody was asking for it. This one's asking that the applicant is. Go ahead, Michelle. Sorry.
The employers, I'm sorry, I couldn't see it. The employer's asking for it?
No, the applicant.
Oh.
Like a medical, somebody, the applicant is well, actually at this point, it's probably a consumer is asking for their file, a complete file. So how do you, and here's the regulation, and how do you handle it in your community?
We would do the same thing. We would only release specific things that we have created. And if they wanted other documents like psychological records or even medical records, we would tell them that since we didn't originate that, we can't release it, but we would tell them where to go to get it. Exactly. And the biggest thing with that is, because especially psychological records, if you just release those to someone and you don't have somebody who's knowledgeable to sit down and explain that information, it could do a whole lot of harm. We had one time where we had a young lady and we sent her for a psychological evaluation, and the tester came back with the result that she was considered developmentally disabled. Nobody had ever told her that. Her IQ came back at a certain level and nobody had ever explained that to her. And so then she wanted a copy of those records, and we sent her back to the therapist that made the psychological evaluation, and he sat down and explained that to her. But that would have been devastating if you never knew that and somebody just handed you all these records. So.
Thank you, Michelle. And you're absolutely right. I think Wayne, when we first started putting this together, talked about what he used to do as a director. And it's exactly what you just stated, where the applicant will sit down with the psychologist will talk with the applicant, and if the applicant wants anything in writing, then the psychologist will provide the necessary documents, so that it's the same thing. If you look at, we're not interpreters, and we can't be the in-between guy when in something so significant as talking to an applicant about their disability, and it might be the first time they're introduced to it. So Michelle, thank you for bringing that up. I see that so Wayne and Jamie both have made some comments in the chat box. Did you want to share verbally?
Yeah, I just wanted, it's so important that we be specific, because at the end of the day, when we get all that information in, and if we just do a general request, we're the keepers of that info. Mm-hmm. So then it becomes our responsibility to go through that. And this is really seen with IHS. IHS used to send, when we would request for documentation from, like, say, this date to that date, say 3 months or 6 months or 3 years, whatever, we would get all the lab reports, we'd get all the notes, we would get you know, and it's like, I don't want to know about people's infections. I don't want to know about, you know, their bad blood work or whatever. I just need to know about that limitation or impairment that's created from the disability that's impeding their ability to work. And so when we start getting dialed in and get more specific, then, you know, we get 3 years of very specific impediment to employment documentation. It's 3 or 4 pages maybe, instead of 30 or 40 pages of medical that we have to take care of. And that really streamlines your process, and it makes eligibility a lot easier. And it's just easier to store and keep.
All right, thank you. And Jamie is in agreement with Michelle. So we can move on to the next, unless somebody has something that they want to share. Does anybody have a policy on this particular regulation?
Do you want to, Amanda, do you want to jump on here and talk about what you just typed?
Sure. So obviously I agree with what Michelle and Jamie and everyone else are talking about. But you might also want to think about how you write a case note. I've had to ask staff to rewrite a case note because they appeared to be, I don't know, snotty, or, you know, they didn't like the way the consumer talked to them. So they actually put it in the case note that, you know, you keep your feelings out of a case note. It should be just the facts. Your client called you and they reported this, or the client called you and requested a service or a meeting, but maybe in the middle of it, they broke down and they were screaming and yelling, and then you wrote something like, oh, they were having a bad day and they were screaming and yelling, so I had to hang up on them, or, you know, I don't know, I can't think of a specific, but I just know that when you're writing a case note, it should be as professional as possible. And if you were ever given a court order where you had to go to court and testify and read a case note, you know, how would you want that to sound in front of the consumer, in front of their lawyer, in front of a judge, a jury, whatever the case might be. So I think you gotta, I just kind of threw that in. That's a whole nother can of worms, I guess. A whole nother training.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because when we're not being responsible in a case note, this demonstrates sometimes a bias, and walls go up, and as you said, Amanda, facts only. It can't be a personal reflection of how you feel about a particular person. This has nothing to do with your feelings. Sometimes that's why knowing somebody in the community, and that's why we're not allowed to be doing, be working with family in any way, or really a very close friend, because our biases come in instead of being objective. So very good point to make there. Thank you. So when we look at these, you know, when we're looking at the next part of confidentiality, the applicant requests for a copy of the doctor's assessment report. And I think that's been pretty well established right from the beginning. Michelle made something. Unless somebody has anything to share, I don't think there's much here that's additional that would be helpful. It just shows you that there is a regulation for it. And what, you know, can you take any of these things that we're providing you today? Like, we'll be providing you the document that has the 34 CFR 371.44. We'll be providing you that document, and you can use that if you don't have a confidentiality policy, that you can use it to develop your own, but you can also use it to embellish and strengthen what you already have. So please be responsible about this. You know, I think we've brought it to everyone's attention and to mine specifically, that, you know, you hold somebody's life dearly in your hands, and how you respond to something can make a significant difference to their whole life, if it's going into court or how they receive information about a disability that they weren't aware of. Anybody else want to share? We have some really great people on here that haven't heard from. Will, you want to share anything, Will? And Casey, anybody have anything additional to add? Julie, Karen, Burdette, Christopher, Susie Calhoun, Joanna, Ruby. And if we don't hear from you, I guess we're just going to have to move forward to the next slide. In your AIVRS program confidentiality policy, how are audits and external evaluations addressed? I'd like some people to instead of writing in the chat, could you kind of raise your hand or just jump in there?
When we had an audit with AIVRTech, I don't know if it was really an audit, Wayne, what do we call that? We had to have the consumers sign a consent specific to AIVRTech for them to be able to look at the records.
Yeah, when we did the case file review.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes. So it was specific to what they needed in the timeline, and it was for like 3 days, start to finish.
Right. And you needed an ROI for that, correct?
I'm sorry?
You needed a release of information for
yes.
to be able to look at those documents.
Yes, and it said what was, and it also said what was happening and why it was being done.
And that was explained to the consumer or applicant, correct? On one of your VRCs. Yeah.
I'm having trouble hearing what you're saying, but I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Where I'm trying to go with this is that there. What about does your tribe do they have an audit of your program? Have you ever had your program audited by the tribe?
Well, we're a consortium.
Okay.
And I don't know how to answer that because I've been with the program for about 2 years, but we've had ongoing different directors. So I am not clear on that. I would have to talk to Kim or one of the other people.
That's okay.
Okay.
Also, there's audits, and then some of you might have in your grant external evaluations. So for those of you that know about this, some of you have been around for a little bit, this is a teaching moment for all of us because we're all, remember that we all come together and this is your time to share. It's not to point fingers that I know more than you know or whatever. It's just how long you've been doing something that gives you a little bit more experience. So can we hear from anyone that wants to try and jump in here? I might I'm going to try and not call on the people that are always willing to share their wonderful thoughts and things. But we have, what about you, Winona? Do you want to share anything? We haven't heard from you this morning. And welcome. I didn't say welcome to you. Good morning. And there's Rachel and Jolene and Joanna and Susie. Come on, folks. Wayne, Jamie, and I, we're trying so hard not to do all the talking. So, Christopher, Burdette, Kelly.
Kim, you put a comment in here. You want to expand on that?
Well, Karen had mentioned she didn't know about any type of audits. We really have not had any type of audits, except for we've had the federals come in and do accounting audits on multiple programs, not just our VR program, but we have hired people to come in and do file reviews, but nobody has actually come in and done like an actual whole policy audit for us before until AIVRTech stepped in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with AIVRTech, we're using you know, we do the intensive technical assistance, so it's not an audit, it's not
Right.
an external evaluation. We work with the program to develop, you know, policies, procedures, and to meet specific needs that are identified by the program. So when we talk about the external evaluations and the audits, Kim, can you give us an example of what that looks like for you? Talk about a little bit about the external audit and what steps you did or the external evaluation, and what steps you took to get those files ready.
Unfortunately, that was prior to me also, but I know that they, like say for the accounting audit, they gave us a list of files and said, I want to look at these, but I'm not sure who prepared them or how they were prepared or if additional release of informations were obtained or not. So I'm sorry, I can't really say. Just like Karen, we haven't been around that long.
Okay.
But
Kim,
for
this is Julie. I can kind of jump in and answer that a little bit because I did have to get the releases of information for the files for our accounting audit, and I did pull those, so that was me on that end. Also for our internal or external reviews, file reviews, I also had to get releases of information from the individuals before we can pull those files.
This is Terry, and with our program, the Hamas Vocational Rehab Program, for the amount of years that I've been there, I believe I've gone through 2 external evaluations, 2 or 3. Anyhow, but anyways, that I can recall. My goodness. To be honest, I'm not sure like what exactly you're asking about it, but just like with my experience, I'll tell you is that what I recall is that we did get that external evaluation done. We have our the policies I believe were looked at, as well as our cases and how we had kept them, what if we had everything in place that needed to be there, our case notes, writing and whatnot, and just a lot of the legal forms, I guess you could call them, if they were in place and dated, signed, and whatnot. I don't know exactly who pulled those files, or I mean like how they were picked, but then I know that we had to bring out several of them for them to be looked at, and then in terms of getting a release for that to happen, to be honest with you, I don't recall. What I do recall is that that our finance program that we work with through the Pueblo they were getting audited, and the finance office wanted case files. I remember that. And then, but that was something, I mean, they wanted case files because they wanted to look at some of the expenditures and whatnot. And I know I believe Rebecca, our supervisor, had kind of, straightened that out. Like, no, you just can't come in and start, requesting for these things without a release and whatnot. So I think I believe they had to get releases or somehow work around it, to be able to at least get the information they were seeking, I believe. But yeah, I mean, that's all that I can recall or remember of a evaluation.
Thank you. I appreciate your input. The reason we're having this discussion between the difference between a release for, when we're sending out for medical information, there's a certain procedure that is followed. You have a certain document that you're to follow, and you're not to send out a blanket release of information. And when we're doing, and this is where it gets a little tricky, and I'm going to remind you that AIVRS responsibility, is to provide you the regulations, but we cannot interpret them. So understand that the personal information that, you know, your organization, whatever your tribe and how your policy reads is how, you know, your organization is going to look at and engage in an audit. And your external evaluation, not every tribe does have an external evaluation, but you never know when RSA may decide to send out, you know, somebody to do a brief audit. What is that? What do all of these look like? Do you need a release of information for each one of these? And that's for you to really do some research and make sure. I keep clicking on that. I'm so sorry. I forget that I have the control here. Make sure that you are understanding this policy, and that if you cannot interpret it, and if you're not able to come up with some plan or a policy based on these regulations, then it really is important for you to have some dialogue with your project officer. You know, one of the things, your final product will not reveal, and this has been discussed in length, will not reveal any personal identifying information without the written consent of an involved individual and the representative. And this goes back to what Christopher was talking about in terms of everyone in the community knows this individual, because there's not very many individuals that have an amputated leg and this sort of thing. So how do you advocate? It goes back to that question. How do you advocate for an individual that is going to be recognized just by their profile, without anything else, without a name, without a location where they live, but their profile will identify them? So we have to go back to being responsible and not sharing. How do we share that information to advocate and get better services? So these are important questions that really need to be answered. You need to really think about how you're going. Only you and your project officer can come up with something that is going to be reliable, give you a reliable answer in terms of how this would form out. Rachel has something in the chat box, and Rachel.
So Suzanne, before we go there, can I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
So I just want to make sure, because this part always gets really confusing when we're working with AIVRS, and we get we come on site, and when we start our initial visits for the intensive TA stuff, a lot of times this gets really confused with external evaluations or audits. So I want to make sure that this is really clear for everybody on the call, that when we come on site to do those things, AIVRS is required to get a release of information, because we're not considered an outside agency or organization as defined under the CFR. So we are coming in and we're looking at this confidential information. We got to have that permission for us to look at that confidential information. As an external evaluator or an auditor, they don't require a release of information as long as it's connected to the administration of the tribal VR program. So really what that is, what Rachel's talking to in this one. And as a director, previous director, when this would happen, I got audited annually on our fiscal component, and they looked at eligibility criteria and then expenditures. That was the two audits, or the two criteria in the audits that I was responsible for. And that's where our identifying information was redacted, and they would only know a consumer case file number. They didn't know the consumer's name or anything like that. It was all based off of a random pull of the case file number. So I just wanted to take a minute and clarify that when we're with AIVRS, we require the release of information because we aren't We aren't doing an external evaluation. We aren't doing an audit. We're doing technical assistance. So we have to have that permission to view that data. Where an external evaluator is not. They're just looking at the process and making sure that the program is meeting CFR and following that protocol. That's all I wanted to jump in. Go ahead, Suzanne. Sorry.
No. Absolutely needed your input there. Thank you, Wayne, for providing that. I was trying to tap into that. I'm glad you jumped in. What I'd like to hear now is, before I turn it over to Wayne in terms of final summary and a wrap up here, I'd like to hear from Rachel, some comments. I'd like to hear from each one of you. Did we cover what you were expecting, the information that you were expecting or requiring for the release of information? So it would be important if we could hear from you in terms of some of your feedback. Is there something else about the release of information that you would like to know?
This is Susie. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I was looking for today was just updates, because I will be redoing my procedures in the next year. So I was just looking to see what was going on and just kind of brushing up my skills. So thank you for your time and all of the information. Thank you for everyone who shared. I think that most of us are using ROIs correctly, and I think that this gives just a clearer definition and something for us to put in our pocket for when we do go with other programs and we do have to explain these things, and they're mapped out in our procedures. So with my tribe, I cannot have policies. Only the tribe will have policies. I have procedures that we work under. So I will be incorporating much of this information for its in written format, for if I have to bring that out, we have it done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie, for your comments. Anyone else would like to provide some comments? You joined the meeting, you had some expectation. Was the expectation filled, or do you have a question that we have some really great people on that are part of this webinar that if we can't come up with the answer, you have some veteran directors on here that can jump right in and help out. So can we hear from you?
Hey, Suzanne, I got a question, if that's okay for the people,
Yep.
For our viewers.
Yeah, go.
So how many of you guys in doing your ROIs and in getting these releases filled out have to deal with program specific ROIs? An example would be like, I don't know, like a psych saying your ROIs suck and they don't cover everything. You got to use ours. Does anybody have any experience with that?
We do with the medical facilities. Like, we have a blanket one that we use with most people. And of course they fill out exactly what they want us to release and all. But for most facilities, we'll take that. But we had to redo it completely in order for the medical center to take it.
Okay. So we're running into that confidentiality clashing with HIPAA. Is kind of what I hear with that. Suzanne, will you share a couple of, I think I got Billings Clinic and St. Vincent's ROIs?
Hold on a minute, let me find it.
So I'm going to have Suzanne pull up one of the ROIs that I had before. And so this is one that's used here locally in Montana. They would not accept, and it was when I got this release of information, it was already filled out. They had identified what I could and could not ask for in this release, which I really struggle with that, because one of our primary items that we watch for and advocate for is informed choice. So if I'm getting this release of information, it's already filled out by the provider. Am I supporting informed choice? What do you guys think on that one? Remember, you got to unmute yourself before you talk, because I know everybody was trying to talk.
The consumer should check those boxes, not us. And with behavioral health, they literally have to initial every little box. So that's what we've got going on.
Okay. Thank you, man. Anybody else have any experience with this?
And Wayne, this is Joanna with the Nez Perce Tribe, and Suzanne. We are the same. Our Indian Health does not accept our ROI. So what we've done is, okay, we'll use your ROI, have everyone sign. However, because of our federal regulations, there are 5, 6 questions. We need you to answer these questions instead of the questions you feel you should give to us, because the first thing that we've run into was, well, you want everything. And I said, no, we just need the treatment plan, how we're working together to keep the individual walking the right road and staying employed. I don't want all your case notes. We don't have files big enough for that.
Right.
However, and we just, a lot of our programs as well kind of question the ROIs that we have set up for our intertribal agencies. So what we've done is that it's just, if the social service programs, it's for comparable services only and nothing more per their IPEs. And it's been quite lengthy trying to educate our tribal programs on how we should work together for our people when it comes to the employment aspect.
This is Michelle again, and one of the ways that we kind of get around that, because we had the same situation where if we would ask for medical records, they'd send us from birth on for people, for a long time, and we don't need all that. But we created consultants review forms. So we have a medical consultants review form, and it specifically asks the questions we need to know. We don't need to know, that the person had measles 10 years ago. We just need to know what is their disability and how will it affect them in terms of employment, all of that kind of stuff. So it specifically lays that out. And we have different ones for different areas. So we have like a psychological consultants review form, an alcohol and drug counselor review form, medical consultants review form. And we also get medical records if we need them, but a lot of times that takes care of us being able to determine them eligible, and it also helps with creating their plan. And it just depends on the person if they're willing to go get that done or not, and if the doctors are willing to do it. But those that are, it makes everything go a lot smoother and faster.
Thank you both for sharing, Joanna and Michelle. Now, Suzanne's pulled up the Montana State VR release of information, and I do have permission to use this, just so everybody knows I'm playing nice. I didn't steal it this time.
Sure.
So as you can see with the state VR release, they get really detailed, where a lot of our releases are less detailed, and it can be beneficial and it can be a hindrance, like you guys were talking about. I found that in developing the relationship with the records department at IHS was the most beneficial for me. I was able to go in and talk to them, and of course it helped that some of my staff are related to the workers there at the records department at IHS, and so we could kind of put some leverage on them, and it really helped us get away from the books of information that we used to get, because we would say we need information on this disability or that disability, and we'd still get all the lab results and learn about all their kidney stones and all the other fun stuff that they've went through in their life. Anybody else have any comments about these releases? And again, these are all going to be available. We're going to put them on our website, and you guys will be able to look at these as needed.
Wayne, this is Joanna, and I just wanted to make the comment because you did ask the question regarding the consumer's informed choice.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have an informed choice when it comes to what the clinic is already, or anyone has made those X's, because our clinic has been the same. We need you to have them initial so they know, and we need to explain. So we don't get to put check marks or X's. They have to use their initials on the medical or NIMI-POO Health ROIs in order for them to accept them.
Okay, great. So again, we have a case of where the hospital is saying this is what we're going to do, but I really like how you're bringing the client in and saying, okay, this is what initial by the things that we can look at. That's a great way to include that consumer.
One of the things that I see here in terms of other, and then to be specific about other, those are really sensitive areas, and make sure that you're being very specific about the other, and that you don't leave something to someone else's imagination where they can, as you say, we get a whole record where, as Joanna mentioned earlier, you just don't have the files to know, oh, well, they had, chicken pox when they were 6 years old. We really just don't need that kind of information. This checkbox here that I'm kind of going around, I'm assuming this would be where Joanna is talking about maybe having an initial rather than just the checkbox. And I think that's a really good idea, because one of the things you also want to make sure when you're doing these documents is that you're sharing with the applicant, and there is a true understanding of what you are seeking. There should be no surprises. An applicant should not be surprised that you know that they were in rehab 6 months ago and things of that nature. So make sure that you're being very open and very transparent. It's really important for the safety and the well-being. And I think someone said, respecting the consumer, the applicant at this point, if we're in the eligibility process. So make sure that you're respecting that individual, and that you're giving them, that all the information that you're requesting, they're aware of. Again, no surprises. I'll turn it over back to you, Wayne. And we are.
Forgot I was muted. I was going to try to start talking. So we got to.
Christopher has something in the box. You might want to hear it. He always has nice long ones, so maybe we should hear from him before we find out.
Yeah, Christopher, you want to jump in here and talk about what you're writing?
I didn't want to interrupt y'all. So I've been in and out, but mostly catching up when I look through all of the chat comments. And we have been collecting ROIs from all the different places we typically work with. And it is true. Some of them accept our ROI just fine, and some of them don't. And so we've been collecting their ROIs and keeping them on a shared server for all of our staff to be able to access. It has made things a little easier because at least we have access to what those other ROIs are. The only trouble we run into is if an ROI from another agency. Let's say they change their format and they want the new format, and we got to, you know, make sure everybody knows about that. But that has helped. It's a little annoying to have our ROI, and it doesn't work for everybody, but it works for some. But as I mentioned in the chat, my real biggest pet peeve is when the clinic sends us an entire med chart. And that is common for us. There are certain clinics that will send us exactly what we ask for, but the one here on the res sends us everything. And it's annoying because I'm reading through sometimes some really sensitive information about a person's medical history that's not germane to our issues. I just want to know, do they have X, Y, or Z that show documents that they have a disability? I don't need to know about all of these other issues they've got going on that have nothing to do with us, but I haven't been able to change that.
You know, when I was thank you, Christopher. When I was a director quite a few years ago, I went and talked with the director of Indian Health Services and the doctor, and that was administrating at the hospital at Indian Health Services. And I also talked with the director of behavioral health, and we created documents. And so that the documents that I would send, they were accepted. And I found out the reasoning why they were having so much trouble with our release of information was the fact that they couldn't find the data that they needed right away. So we had a special box that we put in at the top for the Indian Health Services. And from that point on, after working with them, we went back and forth until we developed a really good product. So you might want to think about that. If you're still having problems and you want to do something with your release of information, you might want to decide that you're going to have a conversation with folks and see if you can't develop something that is acceptable to the directors of those programs. So
yeah, I think it's a good idea. They have a new director at our clinic here, so maybe it's a good time to establish a new relationship and let them know this one challenge that we experience. I do want to resolve it, whatever it takes.
Yeah, good. That sounds good. Okay. Any other comments? Rachel mentioned if the client's hospital have any activities or meetings where a presentation is, I'm wondering if I'm reading that right, meetings where a presentation is able to be done, it can help a lot. I'm not understanding your comment there, Rachel. You want to elaborate on that a little bit? And
I don't know if Rachel has a microphone. Sometimes when she gets on, she doesn't have a microphone. So
turn it over to Wayne.
I can jump in here and kind of explain. I did the same thing. You know, if they're having like an activity or like a meeting or maybe a staff meeting, you go do a presentation on VR as the director or as a staff person from VR and just say, hey, these are the things we need, this kind of the stuff we need to have and not have. And I think
yeah, she's also talking about, she's kind of piggybacking on what Christopher was saying. She's agreeing. Yeah. So, sorry, Rachel. Amanda asks a question. Does anyone use Handle IT database? We hear a lot about, a lot of 477 programs use it. We are looking at it now as a whole partner. And does that have something? I'm not really sure where this is going. I know there are programs that are very linked to the 477, and there has to be a little bit of, have to be really careful. Why don't you talk, Amanda?
I think there's some other comments coming in that are more important.
You know, that's something we can look at as far as a future topic. You know, what databases are out there that we can use and how they interact. Because yeah, it is a hot topic with 477 and the combining of monies or not. So I think we'll definitely note that, Amanda, and we'll put it on a future webinar list. And if I hear anything, I'll get back to you and let you know what I find out. Okay. But I do want to let's stay on track with the ROI discussion. Maisie got on here and say that their program has the applicant fill out application. Then they have the intake interview. During the interview, we have the applicants sign ROIs for tribal employment, rights office, temporary assistance, state DVR, tribal and social. I agree with Chris that Christopher that IHS sends a novel when programs ask for specific information. So yeah, that's kind of the ongoing deal. We all get the novels. Anita states we have a great medical records person at our local IHS who reads the ROI and sends specific information. That is amazing. And you should probably take that person out to supper, a big steak or something, or at least send them flowers, because she's worth the weight in gold. Because yeah, I got tired of reading about bladder infections and flu shots, and I told them to take ibuprofen instead of Tylenol. Those types of things. It gets frustrating especially when you've been waiting for 1.5 months to get that information, and now all of a sudden you got to get your eligibility done. All right, guys, we're winding down. We got 6 minutes left, so you got 6 minutes to put your comments in the box or to interrupt me. As we get going down that path, I'm going to talk about Save the Date. We partnered with WinTAC, and we are getting together on the 23rd to do a webinar about supporting Native American or American Indian Native Alaskan youth with disabilities and how we can streamline that process during the COVID virtual world. We're going to talk about services that are specific to AIVRS programs, services that are specific to state VR, and how we can connect the two together and kind of get that seamless pass through, because we're all here to help the kiddos. As you can see, we're going to have myself, Christine Johnson with WinTAC, Mr. Thomas Draghi coming out of Wisconsin, my northern friend Maria with Verna. She's going to be participating with us. That's Glitzy Verna, again, northern Wisconsin. We have Nicholas with Washington State VR coming in to help us out, and he'll be partnering with Joy out of Lummi VR program. And again, so we're going to have a panel. We're going to have a discussion about how the process they've developed works for them and how we can help start this process amongst other AIVRS programs. All right, so the next slide, other way, Suzanne. And again, it's come to that time where you get to hear me beg and plead and do all my empty promises to get you to fill out our survey. If you would please do that, that'd be fantastic. Will you throw that link in the box there too, John? So now we got 2 links in the chat box. One is to register for the next webinar, and the other one is our evaluation survey. Any last minute questions, folks? You got 4 minutes.
Tick tock, tick tock.
Now we have 3 minutes. It was great seeing everybody on here again. I really like that our webinars are getting bigger. I think we had close to 45 people this go around. And I really enjoy the participation that we're getting. And I think we're covering some really good topics for everybody. And again, as we close, we are always here. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the AIVRTAC crew. We answer emails, AIVRTAC jamie@nau.edu is the general email. I do need some sunblock. Last time I did this out in the sun, I sunburnt the top of my head. It was great. That's what you get for thinning hair, I guess.
Where's Jamie?
She was having trouble with her computer. I think she might have got kicked off.
Well, Jamie, you did a great job. You really got us started. So thank you, Jamie. Winona, we haven't heard from you today at all. You want to say a little word, hello, goodbye? Thank you for watching the chat box. Okay then.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
See
I
you
can't wait till we get to see each other face to face again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Wayne, Suzanne, and Amanda. Have a great week.
You too, Joanna. Bye, everybody. There you are, Jamie. I was wondering where you went to. Your computer up and running?
Everybody watch your emails. We'll be sending a follow-up to make sure you do your survey. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.